War. It's an interesting concept. In war, life is but a number, one to add to an arbitrary total that exists outside of the eventual outcome. You're not an individual. You're not a person. You're a number capable of adding or subtracting from that total. I've learned this after looking through countless records of Korea. You don't find the names of the men who fought to defend our country's rights. You see a number, 271,300, nearly 300,000 lives lost to a conflict that never should have been, 227,800 dead, 43,500 MIA on the Korean side, over 4 times the casualties of the Americans. I look at the MIA total often, a round number, calculated to the nearest 100 for ease of effort. How many men were left unaccounted for by that margin? Then I think back to the forest, those familiar faces among the trees, all tragically extinguished as they shone their brightness. And I can't help but insist that the number should have been far greater. I'm not trying to glorify my position in the war. I'm not trying to say that we fought for what was right. But I will say that I fought for my country, and I was proud to do it. I was only 20 then. I enlisted in the Korean People's Army of my own accord, despite the protest of my mother, whom I'd always hated for marrying the tyrant that was my father. But I won't be too personal here. I won't tell you how his existence impacted mine. How he used to beat me in front of his friends and laugh as they kicked dust in my mouth. How he used to soil my bed when he was drunk, and rub my face in his excrement when I accidentally laid down in it. I'm getting off track. In any case, he was the main reason I enlisted. I just needed to get away from all of it. I won't tell you about my training, because it's the same for any army, but I was deployed 7 months later. I belonged to the 2nd Division of the Ground Forces, the 14th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Section. You've never heard of it. It's because the UN had it removed from the history books after the war had ended. Why? I don't know. Maybe they thought we weren't important enough to be recognized. Maybe they wanted to erase all injustices done by North Korea. Or maybe it's because of what happened on our first mission in 1951. It was March, I recall. The bright emerald leaves were just starting to come out. After the harsh winter the army had on the battlefield. Bonode Fury Squad. That was what we called ourselves. There were 7 of us. Our sergeant was a man by the name of G. We didn't know his full name, and we never dared ask. He was a steel-cold man, that Hollywood stereotype of a battle-hardened hero. We feared him more than any monster, and admired him more than any celebrity at the same time. He was a puzzle of a man, strict, but understanding, at least during training. We knew only one thing about him, and it was that we knew nothing about him. Our sharpshooter was Hyung Wook. He was always talkative and jovial when we were eating or having a group discussion, but when he was on the battlefield, I'd never seen a more focused nor reserved person in my life. Then there was June. He was the youngest of the group, and we didn't know much about him, other than his father forced him to enlist. I deeply empathized with him, and made sure to take him under my wing. Apparently, he and Hyung Wook had known each other since elementary school. Seok-go and Seok-ju were twins, only a year older than I was. I don't remember much about them. And lastly, there was Tae. He was the sergeant's son. I often envied him for having such a noble father, one that treated him well and with respect instead of disdain. I expected him to brag and boast about his father's accomplishments, of which I was sure there were many, perhaps too many to count. But throughout our entire training and development, He never spoke a word to us of his father. After our first day in the field, we had suffered heavy losses on our side. Explosions were booming across the landscape, and bullets pelted the ground at our feet. Our battalion had lost at least 120 men, according to Hyung-wook. As we fired from the defenses, our hands calloused from clutching the T-99s, the sun began to lower below the horizon. Above the deafening crash of a mortar hitting our concrete reinforcements, I heard Sergeant G issue an order. "Break off, fall back." We looked at each other confused. Why was G ordering us away from the defense position? Our battalion needed all the help they could get. Without hesitation, we lowered our rifles and grabbed our snacks. We didn't know what would happen if we disobeyed the sergeant, and none of us wanted to find out. "Let's go." We hopped over the concrete border of our point and began trudging through the slimy grass that layered the area, all except Hyung-wook, who was still focused on sniping the enemy. "Come on, Hyung, let's go." I shouted over the hail of bullets coming from each direction. All of us, except for G and Tae of course, had practiced English extensively to intercept American messages during training, to such an extent that we spoke it solely through habit. Such was required of the youngest soldiers of the People's Army. Hyung-wook turned to look at us, ducking so that the enemy's bullets would not hit him as he stepped away. Then 2 of the bullets went through his pelvis. I don't know how they penetrated the concrete, but they did. Hyung-wook collapsed backwards in a motion of searing pain, bright red blood oozing through his fingers. The rest of the Fury squad rushed to carry the wounded soldier. I grabbed his right arm, Jun his left, Seoko his right leg, and Seokju his left. Tae stared forward in fear, gazing at the viscous red substance that was now pooling on the ground. "Tae, grab a stretcher," Seokju shouted. He stood there, unflinching. I expected G to stroll right over to him and smack him in the face for disobeying. But he did nothing. He simply stood there, arms crossed, tapping his boot against the mud. We had to lay Hyung-wook down on the filthy ground so Seoko could get the stretcher. By the time he returned, he was in unbearable pain. "I can't move my legs," he grunted. We opened up his shirt and saw 2 holes, one that went clean through the top center of his belly, hitting the spine, and another that had gotten lodged somewhere in his groin. We poured solution onto his exposed wounds and wrapped them in bandages. As we struggled to lift our wounded friend, Tae simply stood there. I shot him several pleading glances to get him to help, but he was too absorbed in his fear. Then Sergeant G did something I would never forget. He walked up to our group and pulled Seoko aside, handing him his T-38, and told him to shoot Hyung-wook. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was a small part of me who wanted Seoko to follow orders, to not upset the menacing presence that was G. But that part was overwhelmed by the part that knew what a terrible act it was. "Sir, Sir, I can't do this." With this remark, G's normally stern expression turned to a clear, pronounced frown. Enraged, he tore the carbine from Seoko's nervous grasp and thrust it into his brother's hands, screaming the same awful command in his face. I expected Seokju to refuse like his brother, but what happened next terrified me. He suddenly dropped his gaze and stared straight ahead, clutching the carbine. I could see that his white knuckles were on the verge of bleeding from the force. G moved out of the way of his stare, and for a moment he continued to look off in that direction. He didn't seem to be focusing on anything in particular. It was as if he was a statue, his eyes affixed to a natural position. Then he broke his line of sight with the nothingness and looked at his brother. He tilted his head sideways, almost like a dog examining an intruder to judge whether it's a threat. Then, he turned to look at his wounded colleague. He raised his gun and uttered a phrase of confirmation. "If you say so, sir." Even though I knew what was about to happen, I still couldn't believe my eyes when it occurred. Seokju pulled the trigger and sent 4 bullets through Hyung-wook's heart. With this, Jun screamed and began crying. Seoko simply stared at the act, mouth agape, astonished at what his brother had just done. Seokju lowered the carbine and placed it in Sergeant G's awaiting hands, with a blank expression on his face. G smiled as he acknowledged the act of obedience. I rushed over to the traumatized Jun, still not quite believing what I had seen. And as I lay cradling him, wishing he didn't have to witness such a horrible act, I heard G proudly announce, "A soldier who cannot walk is a war that can't be won." As we headed off into the wooded area, leaving our colleagues unburied, the sky turned a deep shade of orange. I was able to get one last glimpse of it, before it was covered with the black branches of the still bare trees. It was so vibrant that one could barely see the streaks of mortars falling from the sky. We were forced to hike across the muddy landscape under Sergeant G's lead. His explanation for doing so, when we demanded it from him, was that we were setting up a long defense position to combat a supposed US flanking movement. I was too furious at him and Seokju to speak. At one point, G told us to stop and make a fire. Jun, Seokju, and I unpacked our bags to cook the tin rations, while Seoko and Tae were to gather wood. Sergeant G said he would accompany them in order to make sure Tae got his share of work done. With him gone, Jun and I were free to discuss what we'd seen. What was that back there?" Jun asked, still incredulous. "I don't want to think about it ever again," I replied. Then we both turned and stared at our colleague, who was calmly unwrapping his tin of porridge. I realized putting the murder out of my mind would be impossible when in the company of the very person who committed the act. I hadn't felt so much anger for someone since I was home with my father. Just the thought of Hyun's death brought to mind thoughts of many beatings he had incurred on me during my childhood, but I was able to put my personal life out of my head and focus on recent events. "What the hell, Seokju?" I sputtered. "How could you do that? How could you shoot your own squad member? How could you do that? How?" He continued his task, not even caring enough to look at me. "Hey you, answer me. Why did you kill him?" He turned and looked at me with the same blank expression in his eyes I'd seen when he committed the horrible act. He simply said, "He told me to." And with that, he went back to his work. Somewhere in the distance, a bomb hit the earth, sending a crack through the forest. I don't care what G said. You still killed your own friend, a fellow soldier. I was so busy screaming that I didn't notice Jun had picked up one of the rocks we were piling and was now wielding it in his hand. Before I could react, Jun was on him. The rock smashed violently into Seokju's jaw, instantly breaking it. I could hear the telltale crack of bone shattering as the rock went up and down and up and down and up and down, until there was nothing left but bone shards and blood. I pulled back Jun, who curled up in a fetal position, and cried. I couldn't control myself," he whimpered. "It's just, my father, he moaned in remorse. "It's just like what he did." "It's okay, Jun, it's okay. I hugged him, holding back his shaking arms. My mother. She was always mistreated, always put up with it. One day, she went behind his back and made love to the neighbor's husband. He sniffed, tears beginning to roll down his dirt-crusted cheeks. I was friends with his daughter. We were both shocked to find out. When my father found out, though, he didn't seem to be affected. He wiped his nose, burying his head in his hands. He didn't seem to be affected when he took a shotgun to my neighbors and my friend. He sobbed again. I was there to watch it, sang. I was playing in his yard when he just burst through the door and he leaned over and vomited, tears streaming down his cheeks. Seeing Hyun die reminded me of her. Just the senseless murder. I felt so much for him at that moment. I pictured my own father at home, abusing my mother. I knew he would never do such a thing. He was too cowardly. But all the mental torture he'd put me through. I wished I had the courage to do the same thing to him. To just take a rock and pummel his head till his brain spewed out all over the floor. I don't want to fight this war, Sang, he choked. He then looked down at his blood-streaked hands and took in a gasp of air as he stared at what he'd done. All these people were fighting. They all have families too. People who love them. I killed 5 soldiers today, Sang. 6 now. I've resorted to killing my own squad. I think I'm becoming him. I wanted so badly to tell June it was okay, that it wasn't his fault, but I couldn't. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I looked down at Seokju's bloody corpse. I know I should have felt a sense of remorse, like I did for Hyung-wook, but for some reason I didn't. Staring at the dead body made me almost satisfied in a way. I crouched down and began repiling the rocks for the fire pit. The planes had stopped flying overhead, and for the first time that day, there was absolute silence. We had finished the fire pit long before Sergeant Ji, Tae, and Seoko came back. They eventually materialized from the landscape, as if emerging from the trees themselves. I noticed 2 things right away. The first detail I noticed was that Ji was the only one carrying firewood. Tae was empty-handed, and the second thing was that Seoko wasn't with them. June and I held our breaths as they approached. Ji arrived at the pit and dropped his bundle of logs. Tae soon joined him and sat opposite June and I. It was then that he noticed the corpse of Seokju, lying off to the side. He peered at it for a moment, then turned and stared directly at June. I don't know how he knew it. I didn't have time to wonder how, because the next thing he did was walk up to me and hand me his gun. He didn't even have to speak. I knew what he wanted me to do. June knew what he wanted me to do, and Tae did nothing but stare. I took the T-38 and held it in my hands. It was strange to be holding the weapon. It emanated an aura of death, almost as if it were cursed. But I had to admit, it felt solid and weighty in my possession. I stood up and looked into the distance, in the direction of the battlements from where we'd first come. I wondered if this is what it felt like to have power in life, to decide the fate of others. I wondered if my father felt this too. I wondered if he felt this when he beat me, or when he rubbed my face in his excrement. I turned to look at June's pleading expression. All the rage, all the pain I'd put up with through my life, had accumulated in that one moment. I looked at Sergeant G and saw my father. "If you say so, sir," and I pulled the trigger without hesitation. Blood splattered against the rocks. Where G's nose should have been was now a gaping hole, flesh dripping from the inside, as if it were liquid. I lowered the rifle and let it fall from my grip, and listened to it sink slightly into the loomy soil. I should mention that I hadn't killed a single US soldier in battle that day, and I'd just killed my own sergeant. The feeling that came over me was something extraordinary. There was a great pain, a searing, remorseful pang that felt like a stab in my heart, but accompanying it was an almost joyful sensation. A fantastic satisfaction that I had rid the world of everyone else's pain. I was unburdened. I was relieved. I was happy. And then, the feeling went away as I stared downwards and realized what I had done. I dropped to my knees in shock. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I could only look at my calloused hands and cry. "Don't cry, soldier." I looked up, expecting to face a conversation from June. The voice was Tay's. The son of the deceased sergeant stood up and lit a match with his fingernail, tossing it into the pit and igniting the tinder. "There's no need to feel regret over anything that happened today." I looked over to June, expecting the same astonished reaction that I had, but he was staring forward, focusing on something unseen behind Tay. War is a concept that warrants the taking of life. We kill because we see it as right. The dead did not deserve their lives. Out of my periphery, I saw June reach for the pile of guns that lay behind us. But killing is so much more than that. I could hear June grabbing one of the rifles from the pile. Killing is necessary for survival. Ironic, isn't it? I heard the fumbling of bullets being loaded into the rifle. But not only that, killing is the only punishment people will truly learn from. It's an ultimate expression of dominance. The magazine of the rifle clicked into place, and killing is merciful for both the victim and the one holding the gun. June stood up and loaded a bullet into the chamber of his T-99. "What the hell are you talking about, Tay?" he hissed. I detected a hint of apprehension in his voice. "I think you of all people know what I'm talking about," he responded. He smiled. The fire crackled behind him. I turned to look at June, whose expression had morphed into a mixture of horror and remorse. Killing releases the monster inside us all. The fire suddenly bloomed into a full blaze, illuminating Tay's perfectly black eyes, his glistening pointed teeth, his unnatural green veins poking through his skin. Tay muttered something I didn't understand. Without hesitation, June turned the rifle towards his own face. "If you say so, sir." And with that, he pulled the trigger. Tay, or whatever had taken on the form of Tay, disappeared into the woods before June's body even hit the ground. I buried him next to Seok-ju and the sergeant, to the left of the fire pit. I watched as the sun rose above the trees, and my eyes followed a single green leaf that had fallen from above. It whistled its way down until it touched the diminishing flames of the fire and began to curl up. A plane flew overhead, the first of the day, and a mortar dropped somewhere back towards the battlements. I left all my equipment there and simply started hiking in a straight line, away from that place, away from whatever was controlling us. I don't know where it went. I don't know if it's still there. I didn't care. Eventually, I reached civilization and was able to retreat to the US-occupied South, where my English was put to good use. I may not be as deserving of the title veteran as other people. I fought in the Korean War for a day. but I fought in Korea all my life, and since then, I have never stopped fighting.